Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to an online Reflect Talk. We're still broadcasting from the empty library, and this one is called William Shenton's Bookshelf. So you'll see that picture there in front of you that does not contain William Shenton or any books. I have a rather bad habit, I think maybe even a little verbal tick. When I'm presenting these things, I very much like to say, and now I'm going to talk about this person, and whack up on screen a photograph of them. It's a pretty cheap tactic to get people invested. Unfortunately, I can't do that this time because I do not have a photo of William Kernot Shenton, and I've not been able to track down anyone who does. So you'll have to stick with a photo of one of his creations. If you're not aware, just a quick rundown, William Shenton was the builder of both the original wooden mill and the current 1835 mill, which stands on Mill Point. He did quite a few other things, had a go at being a newspaper printer, was an all-round entrepreneur, and the Shenton name certainly lives on, although Shenton Park and places like that are referring to a slightly different branch of the family. So his cousin George, and more particularly George's son Sir George. So the little guy in the picture there isn't George, and you may not be able to read it, but there is a sign on the fence offering cold drinks in the cottage. So, not exactly sure what's going on there. That's 1916. Someone who knows a lot more about the Shentons than me is June Shenton Turner. So if you are in a bit of lockdown and bored and needing some reading material, if you have a look at the Royal WA Historical Society's website, you can buy yourself a copy of The Shentons. I thoroughly recommend it. A very interesting treatment of a pioneering family. And we were lucky enough to have a launch of it down at the old mill itself. So there's June and her son Martin standing pretty much in the footsteps of the original Shentons, and there's some uncouth, unshaven council worker who stuck his head in there. So my argument here, we bring up an image of the library desk, is that William Shenton was in fact South Perth's first librarian, and he doesn't get nearly enough credit. This library in question here is the Old Manning Library. It's about mid-1960s. I'm not sure what the people there are talking about, but they both look rather glum. I think it might be a case of an outstanding late fee, something like that. And what you may not know is, officially still, it was not Manning Library and South Perth Library. They were the Walter Murdoch Library Services. So named after this guy. I can do it this time. There's Walter Murdoch. Almost forgotten now. Despite having a university named after him, he was, in the middle of the 20th century, one of the most prominent public intellectual figures in Australia, and are known worldwide, particularly known for his essays and short columns in the newspapers, Answers with Walter Murdoch. You could write in and ask him any old question, and he would give a long, meandering and quite erudite answer. He usually didn't answer the question at all, but it's entertaining to go along with him. And he was selected as the namesake of the original South Perth Library Service. So just after the Second World War, there was a very strong and healthy volunteer library service in South Perth, but by the 1960s, when they finally became official, Walter Murdoch was still alive, he was retired, his house was on Suburban Road, that's Mill Point Road to you and me, and if you go down and have a look at Sir James Mitchell Park, the first house as you go up the hill towards the zoo, that's the block where Walter Murdoch's house was. So we still do commemorate him. If you've gone through the foyer of the South Perth Library, you've seen him. He looks a little bit creepy with no pupils in his eyeballs, but from time to time I like to put a bit of a funny hat on him. And I think Walter had a bit of a sense of humour. I hope he wouldn't be too offended. Here is my all-time favourite picture of Walter Murdoch. He's talking to another very, very famous person in the mid-20th century who probably wouldn't be recognised now either. That's H.G. Wells. His work's still very much well read. But the reason I bring that up is just the other day I was reading a book in our library called I Am Scrooge, which sets the Christmas Carol story from Dickens in the heart of a zombie apocalypse, and one of the main characters is a literally time-travelling H.G. Wells. And the only reason I bring it up is that during the book, I hope I'm not spoiling it, Perth, Western Australia, becomes the ideal place to hang out while the rest of the world is collapsing around you. So never fear. On the recommendation of a very talented science fiction author, you're as safe as you can be in Perth during this little bit of an emergency. So to get on to what we're actually talking about, William Shenton's Bookshelf, here is one of the fascinating import columns from the Perth Gazette. So I find them possibly even more useful than government records because they show you what private citizens are bringing into the Swan River Colony. And if we zoom in, we can see what's being imported for one Captain Sterling, and yes, that is the man himself. 1 box of books. Gives no indication to what they are, but you can maybe have a guess at the value of these books when you have a look at what else Captain Sterling is bringing in it, and that's 19 terces of brown stout and 5 ditto of ale, so 5 terces of ale. And I don't have to tell you that a terce is half a puncheon. All up, it's about 1/6 of a ton. That's TUN, a great big giant wine vat. And in more modern standards, it is exactly 42 US gallons. So that's an oil barrel, and there is a bit of an unproven argument going around that that's actually where that measurement of oil comes from. So early Texas oil producers got their hands on quite a lot of terces because they were cheap and used them as the original carrying material for oil. No one's proven that, so maybe don't quote me. So books are certainly kicking around the Swan River Colony, and they are quite popular. As you'll see in this article from just a week later, there is a 1 guinea reward being offered for any information about books stolen from the church at Perth. Now, it's a bit disappointing they don't give any titles yet, school books. So certainly the school was attached to the church, and they were already circulating books in 1833. And books could also get you in quite a lot of trouble. So here's another one from a little bit later in 1833, the quarter sessions down at Fremantle. That's basically your magistrates' court hearings. And Benjamin Hinks, charged with breaking and entering, he was witnessed standing at the bookshelf in the harbour master's office, and indeed declared that he was reading a bit. So his defence to the charge of breaking and entering was that he was homeless, he needed a place to sleep, and he was just amusing himself at the bookshelf by reading a bit. He certainly wasn't stealing them. That defence didn't help him at all. You'll see the verdict is guilty, and he got 7 years transportation. So having a browse through some books ends up with, well, if he was lucky, he might have been sent to Van Diemen's Land. If he was very unlucky, he might have gone a bit further up to Norfolk Island. So certainly, books are not neutral, and having a little bit of a browse and amusing yourself can get you in quite a bit of trouble. There were institutions which were trying to operate as we see libraries today, so lending, circulating institutions for books. They really struggled to get off the ground. So we see an advertisement here for a public auction for part of the books belonging to the Western Australian Institution. So one of the early attempts to set up these civil society institutions like the Royal Society and ones like that over in the UK. The Western Australian Institution, certainly not going too well. They had to demand that their members would return all the books so they could sell them, or else they'd have to pay the full value. And there's another advertisement from a little bit later on which finally starts to give us some titles. So you could buy from W. Steele in Fremantle 3 volumes of infantry movements. Sounds fascinating, as well as the general regulations and orders. And if you're really feeling martial after reading all of them, he will sell you a sword. Very nice. Sword and a dirk, so you've got both hands occupied. It wasn't too long before the Swan River Colony had, of sorts anyway, a publishing industry. So I've got a little screenshot here from the State Library. In their collection, they have the first book to be printed in the Swan River Colony. So it's an account of a libel trial. William Nairn Clark versus Charles McFall. Incidentally, McFall had been one of Shenton's early business partners. They tried to set up a newspaper down in Fremantle. Didn't get too far, not too much news going around in 1832. But anyway, I like to think of it as the first book. I'm reminded by a much better historian than me, Mr. Steve Errington, that pamphlet is probably more appropriate. But even still, by 1835, books are becoming a traded object around the Swan River Colony. So there's the intro. Really what I want to talk about is our first librarian, Mr. Shenton, and you'll see his advertisement, signed at the bottom, W.K. Shenton from the Perth Gazette in 1838, where he is demanding the return of the following books, which he has lent out to people around the colony. So there's 9 titles. Finally, we actually start to see some titles. And I find it incredibly interesting just to see what is being read. So these books here, Shenton imported at considerable expense to himself. Space was at a premium in ships coming out to the colony. And due to some fantastic digitisation efforts over in the United States, we can have a little look-see at the title pages of these books and see what they're about. So the first one is Sinclair's Code of Agriculture, which you see right there. It's exactly what you would expect some enterprising entrepreneur to bring to a colony where he would expect to be involved in agriculture. Basically a huge almanac, gives you advice on what to plant, when, how to harvest. More interestingly, the second one, The Million of Facts, is kind of the opposite if we're talking about reputable books. It's a giant compilation. It describes itself as a commonplace book of useful references, subjects of research and curiosity. So basically table after table of everything you might need to know about anything. These were still being printed well into the 20th century. There was a series by Irving Wallace, which was The Million of Facts, basically trivia endlessly throughout the pages. This is an American edition, so I'm not going to claim this particular one was read by Mr. Shenton, but I'd like to think he had a look at the tables of transference of force and steam engines, and you can see here right at the bottom of the page, doing a few calculations. If you want your windmill to provide 1 horsepower, that's 5 men's power, your sails will need to be 17.89 feet. And the sails on the mill now are considerably longer than that. That's only about 5.5 meters. And it's a bit of a reminder that those ones are not original at all. They're in fact a copy of a copy created in 1957 by Brisbane and Wunderlich. So we're not quite certain what the sails would have looked like. Maybe there's a little bit of a hint there, but certainly Shenton was bringing along things that would be useful for him. It leads us on to the third. This might have been useful in some odd ways. He has a copy of Mathematical Magic. So this is Bishop Wilkins' treatise, actually a 17th century work, quite famous because it's in 5 books. The first 3 or 4 books pretty much deal with things you can actually see, quite detailed explanations of how to build things like a windmill, but by the time you get to the end, you've devolved into perpetual motion machines. So Mathematical Magic is quite apt. In the 17th century, mechanical geometry, as it says, was very well practiced. It is a proper manual of engineering, but it doesn't actually separate itself from magic. Quite a lot of alchemy and all kinds of speculation thrown into that book. Mr. Shenton also had himself a volume of the Transactions of the Society for Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. This is very much not the Royal Society of Arts, although their title page maybe makes me think they'd like you to think it is. It's a rival institution, so they're basically a society which reads out at their monthly meetings contributions to arts and the sciences. And in this sense, arts is the manufacturing arts. And by the 1830s, they are indeed getting contributions from Australia. I couldn't find any from Western Australia, but over in New South Wales, they're doing all kinds of experiments with ploughs. And to distinguish themselves, perhaps from the Royal Society, as early as 1831, when this volume is printed, they were accepting contributions from women members. And in fact, in their founding constitution, they say that be you man or woman, you're a member on the same standing. So it took another century or so for the Royal Society of Arts to catch up to that. Quite groundbreaking. Being a good staunch Methodist, Mr. Shenton, of course, had a physico-theology. So they are essentially sermons, but they are studies of the natural world in aid of proving the existence of God. He also has a very interesting book called The Chemical Pocket Book, and it's by James Parkinson, who is the Parkinson of Parkinson's disease. He didn't name it himself, but after his death, it was found that he had pretty much diagnosed it. He was a chemist and also a physician. But it's interesting to speculate. I'll probably lose my historian's license. But the young cousin, George Shenton, who certainly worked for some time with William on his windmill, was, of course, the Swan River Colony's first pharmacist. So maybe, just maybe, this is one of George's books being topped in. A little bit of speculation. And you can see from this page inside, while it is quite a serious book on the chemical effects of different compounds, you have to have some Egyptian-looking hieroglyphs thrown in as well. So chemistry's still not quite shaken off its magical origins. One of the only books I think might be for fun in this little pile is 60 Curious and Authentic Narratives and Anecdotes. So these are just a big collection of stories. You'll see the lowest red headline there is that they are about voluntary human suffering, and that's exactly what they're about. It's basically a collection of penny dreadfuls, all the horrible things that can happen to you if you sail off to the colonies. So certainly some bedtime reading for somebody in Perth. Shenton also had Lawrence's lectures, which makes me think he was quite a well-read person, maybe more than we thought. Lawrence is sometimes attributed with being a bit of a precursor to Darwin in The Origin of Species. I think that goes a little bit too far, perhaps, but they are quite fascinating, his lectures on physiology and zoology. So looking at the natural world and making comparisons, and you'll see it also speaks of the natural history of man. So while I heartily recommend it, if you do read yourself an online version, brace yourself, because it's not very long before you start taking shots of different heads of different races and measuring them with calipers. So it's exactly that kind of 19th century scientific racism. So I don't endorse it, but it is a fascinating little read, and possibly gives us some idea, if we take these as a whole, of what people were reading in 1838 in the Swan River Colony, which I don't know about you, but I think it's much, much broader than I ever would have imagined. We don't see too many novels in William Shenton's collection. I think he's rather a serious man, but mixed in with the proper Code of Agriculture and the engineering manuals are some very fascinating little reading for pleasure, I would think. If we come back to the advertisement, you'll notice that I've skipped one. Right at the bottom, Lathantis trios for 2 flutes and the pianoforte. I think we can take a wild guess that there's some sheet music here. But if you do put the quotation marks around that sentence and put it into Google, the only hit you will get is the Trove reference to this actual advertisement. So it remains a mystery for me. I could not find a composer called Lathantis, so I put it out to all of you. If anybody's got a copy of this sheet music, localhistory@southperth.wa.gov.au. I'd be very much fascinated to hear about it. So here ends my argument. As I said before, definitely risking the historian's license. I don't care too much about qualifications. A librarian isn't somebody who necessarily lends out the books or who's done a degree in librarianship. Of course, the librarian is the person who publicly embarrasses you when you don't bring them back on time. So going on that definition, William Shenton is certainly, in 1838, South Perth's first librarian. Thanks very much, everyone. Wash your hands and stay tuned for some more Reflect Talks.